My name is Salpi Hazarian. I'm director of the Institute of Armenian Studies here at USC Genocide. And I started life out as a librarian, which means that I first check out books from the library, see if it fits, and then I go buy them. They're kind of like clothes. I checked out Sandy Tolan's The Lemon Tree. I got it on order at Rowan's because it's going to be my airplane reading tomorrow, so it did fit. We're very happy today to have Sandy Tolan here. Sandy is a professor at Annenberg, but closer to my heart, he's a radio journalist. He's a journalist who spent a great deal of time in the Middle East, and I suspect he will agree if I say that whoever said that if you think you understand the Middle East, that means nobody's explained it to you. And today, if we're successful, we will just help you see more of the complexity, not necessarily answers, but certainly more questions. To help us do that, we're very lucky to have Harout Ekmanian, who is born in Aleppo, as am I, as are many, many Armenians, in Aleppo, Syria, lives in Armenia now, as do many Syrian-Armenians, partly because of the war and other reasons. Harout is a journalist, he's trained as an attorney, he is one of those still rather rare members of a minority group in the Middle East who ventures out of that minority group and has as many contacts, colleagues in the bigger world than many. And in that capacity, Harout has worked now as producer at civilnet.tv, which is an internet television in Yerevan, where we both worked. And we've benefited from his ability to see things on the ground as a person wearing many hats, as an Armenian, as a Syrian, as a journalist, as an academic, as a human being who sees a whole lot of problems. And thank you again for both of you for agreeing to do this. Thank you all for coming. Please.
Thank you, Salpi. It's really an honor to be asked to do this. Can you all hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. And Harout, welcome. I understand this is your first trip to the United States, so
thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Welcome, as they would say in Syria, ahlan, and I'm glad that you're here. So I thought I would just give you a little bit of additional background to what Salpi mentioned. You've worked with Arab, Armenian, and Western media for several years, and you have the advantage of the international journalist in being fluent in multiple languages. In your case, I understand Arabic, Armenian, English, as well as Turkish. So that obviously helps you around the region really well. I wanted to ask you, I mean, one of the things that I've been learning just as I've been in preparation for talking with you today, Harout, is the work that you've recently done not too long ago on the Syrian-Turkish border. You did a short film, and rather than give all the background, I wondered if you could just tell us about your recent journey to the border, what you saw, what was the feeling of it, obviously the situation there just in the last year or so. I mean, it's changing tremendously every day. We hear a lot about ISIS, but the situation has been changing on the ground for well before the formation of ISIS, as you well know. Tell us why you went recently to the border and what you saw.
Well, the reason that I went to the border was connected with the invasion of a town on the Syrian border with Turkey, which is very close also to the Mediterranean coast, which is called Kesab. It is historically Armenian, inhabited by Armenians since hundreds of years ago. It is considered one of the last remnants of the Cilician Armenian kingdom that used to exist there in the medieval ages. That has a very important role in Armenian culture also, because personally remembering from my from my family history, my father's elementary school teachers were all from Kesab, and many of our intellectuals in these areas are from Kesab, because it used to be a beacon of Armenian culture and Armenian literature and language. So it used to be, it has this special significance among Armenians in the Middle East, as a mountainous and close to sea summer resort. So that town was captured basically. I would not call them Syrian rebels. I would call them by radical groups, which were basically supported by other countries, not by the Syrian people themselves. They invaded the border from the Turkish side. They passed the border unchecked. They were supported by the government basically, because the border was open in front of them to go inside Syria, and they invade the town. And the population of the town escaped from there to south to other Syrian cities. But nearly 2,000 elderly people couldn't leave the town, and they stayed there. And they were used for propaganda.
By the rebels?
By the rebels, or if we call them rebels, and also by the Turkish media, Turkish mainstream media, not the alternative media. They were also used by them, as we saved them, we transported them safely to Turkey, etc. That was a point that showed how media can be biased among many other stages during the Syrian conflict or during the Arab Spring. And that point was so significant of how to use some people's human suffering as propaganda for other reasons. So basically, the Turkish media, mainstream media, was presenting it as a victory and as a very generous step by the Turkish government to let them come to Turkey and to help them. But basically, there was another Armenian village on the other side of the border inside Turkey, which is called Vakıf. Vakıf village was a part of the 7 villages, Armenian villages, that formed the Musaler, the Musadag. There is this, those of you who have read maybe Franz Werfel's novel, The 40 Days of Musadag, which was about the resistance of Armenians against the invading Ottoman army during the 1915 that were coming to execute another step of the genocide of the Armenians. But the people there resisted, and they could later, they managed to run away with French ship. They survived basically, so they left their homes, but they lost their homes, their territories, their everything, but they survived. But one village remained there. That village was the Vakıf village, the Vakıf Armenians. Now it's a very small village. It's like almost 150 people. Those people were the ones who, a few months ago, they took care of these 2,000 elderly people from Kesap who were taken from the border to the Turkish side. When I went there to visit them, so I went to Vakıf village, the Armenian village inside Turkey, the last one, basically, which I will open parenthesis now. Vakıf today is not a village anymore because of the recent change in the province of Hatay, the province that Vakıf is there. Because of a recent change, it became now a neighborhood. It's not a village now, because the city transformed into a metropolitan city, into a bigger city. So some villages lost their status as villages and became neighborhoods. So I'll close the parenthesis and come back to Vakıf. And when I was there, I met those 2,000 elderly people, and I wanted to show the real story, to their human sufferings and what they went through this short 20 minutes film.
Mm-hmm. So, for those of us who don't understand the regional context, obviously there are so many, as some people describe it, it's a global struggle in a regional context. There's different world powers, obviously in the United States and Europe and the Gulf states, and more closely, obviously, Turkey, Syria, and then the rebel groups, or the so-called rebel groups, as you say. But let's just ask this question: why, in your view, would Turkey decide to allow the rebels to use Turkish territory? Is it simply to fight the Assad regime? Is it, and then they were scoring, in your view, propaganda points to show their generosity towards the Armenian community? What are the reasons they would allow these rebels or these groups, Nusra Front and Al-Qaeda, according to some of the things I've read, Jabhat al-Islamiyya, why would they allow that to happen?
Well, this was not the first occasion where the Turkish side allowed many groups to use the border to initiate attacks in the Syrian side. It started long ago, since the militarization of the Syrian uprising movement. Since the militarization of the Syrian uprising movement, since militant groups started to appear and they were formed, they took Turkey as their headquarters, as a ground to initiate their attacks inside the Syrian territory. So this was not the first time, and this was not the first time also where the most radical groups initiate attacks supported by the Turkish side, like went unchecked and all the roads and borders open into towns that they didn't have any interest to go. One of them was Ras Ulayn, for example, basically inhabited by Kurds. It was invaded in the start of 2013. In 2013, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was in January that also Jabhat al-Nusra, the Nusra Front, which is the franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria. They initiated another attack on this town, and they committed a lot of atrocities, so many atrocities there. So this was another occasion of how the radical groups came from the Turkish territory and went unchecked and entered the Syrian territory, supported by all the arms and ammunition, and they launched an attack on a town that they didn't have any interest to capture. There was no, for example, in Ras Ulayn, there was no army positions, Syrian government forces, or anything else. You know, it was basically under the Kurdish control, and they were just seeking self-defense and self-control, and to secure the citizens and the population that were living in these territories. So that was another example how these things also happened before that. I would not say that the reason the reason that Turkey supported and still supports the radical elements, the radical groups, is just to get rid of the Armenians, or just to hurt Armenians or whatever. That would be a very shallow statement of me if I would say that. Because in the end, we are speaking about a country of 23 million, and the Armenians are a very small minority group, less than 1%, and even less than that. So, but yet again, that doesn't mean that by achieving other goals, on the other hand, Turkey also achieves this too. For example, we see in the 20s, in the 30s, when the Syrian state was formed under the French mandate. At those times, there are a lot of official letters from the Turkish side to the French mandate, complaining and protesting the fact that there were a lot of Armenians inhabiting on the Turkish and Syrian border. The Turkish side, under Kemal Atatürk's presidency at those times, They were protesting that they don't want Armenians close to their border. They want them away from their borders. So that mentality, that Kemalist mentality, was the basis of the Turkish Republic, and I would not say that that is far away. That might be also a reason that an Armenian town, even if the last one, even if it is the small town on the border, would, if it was erased from there, would also help them. But considering that the whole surrounding of the town of Kesab were inhabited by Turkish population, about the Turkmens, which considered themselves, who consider themselves basically Turks more than Arabs inside Syria. Well, yeah.
Well, let me just ask you. I mean, I want to get back to your experience in talking with the elderly people from Kesab, but I wanted to also ask you. I mean, as we know, I mean, you're talking about 9 million Syrian refugees or internally displaced. As you point out, the Armenians are a small fraction of that number. How does the experience of the displaced and the refugees who are of Armenian descent from Syria parallel or differ from the overall experience and the tragedy of what's happening in Syria, especially for the refugees and the internally displaced? What's the similarity and what's different in your view?
I will start from the differences. If we speak about the numbers, for example, there are more than 1 million people who are already in Lebanon, maybe 1.5, and majority of them living in camps and in very difficult conditions. The same goes for Turkey, which with even bigger number. And apart from the refugees who are living in camps, also there are refugees who are living in the cities. So they are not in the camps, but in the cities. They taking care of themselves by their own means. The conditions of the refugees in the camps cannot be compared at any level with the conditions of the Armenian refugees who are basically taking refuge in Armenia, because there is a huge difference also between Syrian-Armenians and other Syrians, because Armenians also have another homeland, have another place to go in case of crisis. So that was the advantage, the only advantage that they have among other Syrian refugees. So they came to Armenia. They as normal Armenian citizens. They were treated as normal Armenian citizens, even though they didn't have passports, but they could get it easily. And different other conditions. Well, Armenia also has its economic problems and also political problems. That's another issue. But comparing to the Syrian refugees, they are completely varied in different circumstances. But if we compare the human suffering, where Armenians who live in Syria, where basically most of them came to Syria after the Armenian Genocide, and that was Syria for them was a safe haven, that provided survival for them, and not only for them but for the whole world Armenians. Armenians, most Armenians in the United States, also in European countries, and even far in Latin America, they have passed a certain stage of their family life in Syria, in the lands that are now the Levant, the Syria, Lebanon, and these countries. Aleppo was how can we say, the so-called capital of the Armenian diaspora in the 30s, especially 40s. For many Armenians, I even met Armenians here who have still, they born and lived here, but they have still relatives in Syria. So that has a special resonance in the Armenian in the Armenian discourse, in the Armenian the traditions. So when when the Syrian crisis started, when the waves of refugees started to appear, among them also Armenians, that drew similarities also between this experience and between the Armenian experience in the 1915. A lot of Armenians also compared this as a second wave of immigration and taking refuge in another country. Like after finding a safe haven in Syria, now being forced again to leave the country,
Yes.
to go back to go another place, to go to even Armenia. Even going to Armenia for a lot of people was not going back to homeland, even if Armenia was a part of the bigger homeland that they had before the 1915. But it was also hard for them because they were leaving their homes, they were leaving the place that they finally found peace. So that's the similarities that I can imagine.
And Harout, what is the for the people that you interviewed, the elderly folks in Turkey who had just come from Kasab, and in your experience as a Syrian-Armenian, as someone from Aleppo, what is the echo, especially now, of the genocide among the? And is this just bringing this up again, almost like a historical trauma that's energized in some way?
Mentioning that, yes, that is reviving that historical trauma in some way, but in another way it's also being exploited by media, being exploited by different political movements also. For example, when the attack on Kasab started, when most of the population could run away and they were survived, and for the first days at least there were no casualties, human casualties, but suddenly there were some newspapers I don't like to mention that ran headlines that 80 or whatever number of Armenians were killed.
Which was not true at all.
Which was not true at all, and those headlines still exist on the internet. You can find them now. They didn't remove it later, and a lot of propaganda started after that.
And there was something about a grotesque image with a cross that was completely fabricated, correct?
That image, exactly, I mean, specifically that image was used a lot during the Syrian conflict. It was used during the Kasab issue, it was used before that, in Malula, it was used even before that in other occasions also, which was an image of I think it was a scary movie.
It was like a horror film that they
took
this image and just completely distorted the context.
It had nothing to do with Syria.
Yeah.
And a lot of similar propaganda started to take place, and the comparisons with the issue of Kasab with the Armenian genocide, saying that another genocide against Armenians is taking place, was a little too heavy, you know. Yeah. It was comparing what's happening in Kasab or whatever is happening inside Syria, or where Armenians are bearing also a part of the consequences of the Syrian conflict, comparing that experience to the Armenian genocide would diminish the importance and the significance of the Armenian genocide itself, that the effects of the Armenian genocide and its political and legal consequences. Because when you say like 80 people were killed and then suddenly it comes out that it was not true, a lot of people who are not really well informed about history will come out and say that, so the Armenian genocide that you were comparing with, maybe there were not 1.5 million people were killed, maybe there was also only one person, or people were removed from a place. So that will cast doubts on a real historical event that took place 100 years ago. So that's the dangerous part of the whole propaganda that is taking place, and the comparisons.
So, as a journalist, you're bearing honest witness to what you've actually seen, and obviously the sorting through the different political interests and strategic interests who have their own interests all across the spectrum in distorting certain things for their own, obviously, national or sectarian objectives. But at the same time, it's important, I think, to get back to your experience with the elderly people, because no matter what the political agendas of all these different players are, there's a great deal of suffering from the displacement, from the expulsions, or the flight, at least from the town of Kesep into northern to southern Turkey. So, talk a little bit about your experience in being a witness to their experience.
Well, it was a little bit difficult to be a journalist, to do your professional job at one hand, and the other hand, being with all these elderly people over 70, 80, or 90 years old. Some of them even couldn't walk. Doing this all together, like holding a camera on one hand and giving a hand to another elderly on the other hand, or taking selfies with them just to cheer them up and give them more morale, you know, and on the other hand, reporting after 10 minutes on Skype, like what's happening over there, and the sounds of bombings just a few kilometers away. Living all this together was a special experience, and for me, those elderly, those 2,000 elderly people, I didn't look at them as Armenian elderly. In looking at their eyes, they were just. For me, they were also Armenians. They were Americans. They were Turks. They were Arabs. They were Kurds. They were just elderly people. They were living in peace, and somebody came and distorted that peace. That the peace that we're living there. They just wanted to live in peace and die in peace in their homes. Some of them didn't leave their homes for 15 years. They just go in the garden and come back to their home, you know, like somebody else brings their water or bread or do their shoppings. So these people who were really disturbed, both psychologically and physically, they were really disturbed. That explains the most part of the whole human suffering that is taking place today in Syria.
And that, maybe you could talk a little more about that. I mean, from my experience in working in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in this new book I've been working on in the West Bank, the sort of historical longing, whether it's of an individual or passed down from generation to generation, of the desire to go home, and the memory, even if it's a collective family memory passed down from generations of a stone arch or an olive tree or a lemon tree. It's very powerful, and it actually can be at the root of political movements as well. What did you see in the longing of these people? You talked a little bit about it, but I remember from one of the translations I was reading from your short film, you referred to the silent expressions on the faces of the elders. Talk a little more about that.
One of those expressions of one of those elderly was that there was an image I saw. Some of our colleagues went before us and took some photos there. An image of one of those elderly holding a key in his hand, the key of his home, you know. That brought back memories of my childhood, learning about the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian people's experience.
Yeah, keys are very much evoked in the refugee camps and elsewhere.
I had Palestinian friends myself, and I visited them, and they always had this key, the key of their old home from Palestine, from Nablus, from Jerusalem, Ramallah, or wherever. That was, for me, that was a backlash for me, to go back to see all these things now happening again and again. And the similarities are so strong, and it really puzzled me at that moment.
And what were some of the things that you remember most about being told? And were you able to get a sense as to whether they will be able to go back to Kesep anytime soon?
Well, at that moment, I was almost certain that they wouldn't go, even though I was comforting them that this will end soon, that you will go back to your homes again, and etc. But I was almost certain that they will never see their homes again, and I was really I was worried about many of them, because the mere their whole reason for existence is their homes, you know.
Their gardens.
Their gardens, their homes, and the
Farms.
most important part, when you mentioned the gardens, I just remembered many of them were saying that we don't care about what will happen to the walls, what will happen there. They were worried about their trees. They were worried about their gardens, because trees means a lot of things. The lemon trees, the other trees, the apple trees for them. Because they treat trees, these people are farmers, they treat their trees as their friends, as human beings. And they were very worried that who will give the medicine to these trees, who will cut the leaves, who will clean the worms, who will water them, who will take care of them. So these bonds of the human bonds with their trees, with their ground, with the soil, that was too strong. That was the first time in my life that I have experienced this kind of human bonds with the land.
Mm-hmm.
That goes for the Kesab Armenians. That goes for the villagers who left also their fields and their trees across Syria and took refuge in other places. That goes for the Palestinians. That goes for every persecuted people.
Many rural populations and their attachment to land it's so powerful. I wanted to ask you, by the way, Salpi, should we leave some time for questions? So, yeah. So, in about 10 minutes, or just give. 10 to 1, right? Okay. So let me ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up. The 100th year anniversary of the genocide obviously is coming up next April. What is, in your experience as a Middle Easterner of Armenian descent, is your sense of the consciousness, both politically and just in terms of historical memory, of the genocide among the Syrian-Armenians, for example, or the Turkish Armenians, as compared to what you know about that consciousness here in North America?
We're on the eve of the 100th centenary of the Armenian Genocide, as you have mentioned, and for Syrian Armenians who lived on the grounds where the Armenian Genocide has taken place 100 years ago, was the resonance was so much different, maybe, than those of the other communities of the Armenian, those other communities of the Armenian, but the diaspora in other places. For example, I'm from Aleppo, and before the uprising, for example, you could just drive like 400 kilometers or 300 kilometers away, like 4 or 5 hours drive, and you could go to Deir Zor, which is considered the Auschwitz of Armenians. That was the last concentration camp where hundreds of thousands Armenians were finally killed there, but they were killed along the road, but the final place was there also. So living on those places, I had Armenian friends. I have a lot of university colleagues, my Arab friends from Deir Zor, you know. These lands were not for me just things that I read in the book. These lands were places that lived, that existed, even though it carried the memory of the Armenian Genocide. For many Armenians around the world, or non-Armenians also, who read about the Armenian Genocide and the World War I and the experience that has taken place in the Middle East on those territories, maybe Deir Zor wouldn't and the other lands, not only Deir Zor, also Ras Ulaim, also Aleppo, which was basically the main place where all the refugees from Syria were gathered there. It was the main station where the survivors have taken refuge, Aleppo and its countryside. So that resonance is a little bit different from one place to another. Given that after 100 years, this kind of sectarian massacres and genocides and crimes against humanity are still taking place, this shows of the importance of what impunity, the lack of impunity or can cause. When the Armenian genocide, for example, if the Armenian genocide and the Seifo of the Assyrians and other crimes against humanity were recognized, were denounced, were punished decades ago, perhaps we wouldn't have seen many of the atrocities that we are witnessing today in Syria and across the Middle East.
Strong point. I have one more question, but I don't want to eliminate the opportunity for those of you who have a pressing question, or any question at all for that matter. We have a little bit, can we go over time a little bit, Salpi?
Yes.
Okay, so anyone with a question or comment? Yes?
I'll wait for you to do your question.
Okay, well, I guess my last question then is, what is your impression of the U.S. role right now in Syria? And I mean, Syria and Iraq. I mean, that's a big, but I mean, within the context of the conversation we're having, this is a kind of an unavoidable question, especially as we're here in the U.S.
Well, that's a very broad question. Well, the United States involvement in Middle East didn't start just with the drone attacks that are taking place in the last month. It existed even long before. It existed, maybe if we go a little bit back during the invasion of Iraq, let's say. Maybe a lot of the things that started today takes back its roots on those periods. And even since the start of the Syrian uprising, we cannot say that the United States was not involved at all. United States allies were involved, actually, also. Well, how can I answer, for example, what? If you can elaborate more, maybe I can help more. For example, if we will speak about the latest debates about inside America that is taking place about, for example, moderate rebels.
Let's just focus on that, because otherwise we could be here all day.
Yeah. For example, mentioning moderate rebels and emphasizing that and focusing on that and designating hundreds of millions of dollars of fund to help and support them. I think that's a point that's a point of failure also, because I still cannot put these two words together. How can you be a rebel and a moderate? A rebel cannot be moderate, first of all. Second, if you look at the opposition scene or the opposition's scene inside Syria today, there is no room for moderates at the moment, especially when the conflict is this much militarized and supported by monarchies who don't have democracies in the Middle East. I do not think that there is any room for moderates. Those are carrying guns today in Syria. I think there are almost no moderates among them, and the latest groups the supposedly moderate groups, which were designed as moderate groups or presented or propaganda as moderate groups inside Syria, they were crushed by Al-Nusra Front and other jihadist groups, and all the arms and ammunition and the weapons that were given to them by the United States were taken by the radicals. So this is an example of what we are going, where we are heading now at the moment.
Yeah, and as you pointed out to me, there's a satirical piece in the New Yorker, I guess this week, about the moderate rebel application form, which is worth looking up. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Robert. You answered part of my question now, but historically, minority groups have sort of thrived under colonial powers, not only Armenian but others as well. And when the colonialists leave and the nationalists take over, then the minorities are in dire straits. It's something of an anomaly that the Christian population of Syria, at least, tacitly supports the Assad regime, even though we know the Assad regime is a regime. And I don't know where that's going to lead, but you characterize all of the opposition as being sort of implacable and radical. And my question is, what if they are successful? Is there any dialogue between Armenian leaders and members, or is there any room for dialogue between Armenian leaders and members of those who are now in opposition to the Assad regime? I understand why they support the Assad regime, but there are alternatives, and what happens if there is an alternative end? That is, if the Assad regime is removed, where does that leave the minority populations?
Professor Vanessian, you mentioned a very important point, that is the failure of the Armenian community itself and many of the minority Christian communities inside Syria. Since the start of the Syrian uprising, many of the communities or the official leadership of these communities were even had to or wanted to be on the side of the government forces, for example, and that prevented many of these communities, many of these groups to establish bridges with the other side. But that was not a one-sided treatment of the issue. But on the other side also, there were also some attempts to establish these bridges which were not respected by the various opposition groups. While mentioning opposition groups, I am basically talking today about the militant groups, because the political opposition is first not in the country. They are in exile. The biggest opposition group, which is the National Coalition, most of them have French, American, or British nationalities. They have taken Turkish nationalities, for example. The most prominent leaders like George Sabra and the former leader of the coalition and others. They have they are becoming the agents of other powers, basically, and they are not leading negotiations. They are just being used as vehicles by other regional powers. So there is no, I don't see that there is no possibility to negotiate with these groups themselves. Rather than, I would say that negotiating with those partners who are supporting and have their agendas, maybe talking with them would help the minorities and the Christian minorities who are now inside Syria. For example, I wouldn't recommend going and starting relations with the National Opposition Coalition, which is based in Istanbul, or any other militant group on the ground. I would say that if any of these communities or the groups want to finally have a deal to coexist and to not be a part of the bloodbath, maybe they would have to eventually have to negotiate with a little bit one level up, you know, to go to negotiate with other powers that are supporting them. Maybe the United States, maybe a lot of allies of the United States have a big impact on this issue here.
Other questions? Anyone else with a question? Yes.
Hello. So I know you probably come and give talks to all sorts of audiences, and you probably heard a lot of questions over and over. I'm wondering, what question do you not get that you wish the public were asking?
That's a good question. Well, I'm better at answering. Well, the question, the question that I usually don't get that. Let me think. I have never thought honestly about this, but I would love to more, for example, also talk. I love our discussion that we had today, but there are also other points that it would be perfect if we had time to also discuss these things. For example, what is the how was the situation, this dissident movement before the uprising inside Syria? Where did it all come from? How was the dissident movements in other countries in the Middle East? Where do they take their roots from? And how it developed into what we have today. For example, if we take Egypt, and which had more room for debate even under Mubarak's dictatorship, and there were dissident groups which used to make public campaigns, they used to declare their political goals, and they used to rally, and they used to mobilize people, even under Mubarak control, which didn't exist in any other Arab dictatorship. Let's call it in any other Middle Eastern dictatorship. It didn't exist. It didn't exist in Libya. It didn't exist in. It doesn't, and maybe for a long time will not exist in the Gulf monarchies, in the Arab Gulf or Persian Gulf monarchies. It doesn't exist in Iran. It doesn't exist in Syria, but it existed in Egypt, and they succeeded in doing a very big popular movement, and they overthrew the government, and they did elections. But if you see the scene today, how it is now in Egypt, it's even maybe worse than what it has been under Mubarak. Seeing all these contrasts makes us think that how you can make a sustainable dissident movement that can create a real democratic society, a real sustainable democratic society where you don't have to worry about being a minority or a majority, where there are civil rights that are respected, where the human rights are respected, where you don't have to negotiate with this or that power to maintain your survival, you know, where votes can decide the future of the country and not anything else.
Anyone else? The question, yes, let's have this be the last one.
Obviously, the refugee situation in Syria is similar to other refugee situations, refugees of war. But can you talk a little bit about the refugees, their faith, and their situation right now, and what is going to happen to them? Because obviously there are many refugees in Lebanon and Turkey and Armenia.
Well, it's difficult to imagine what can happen. It depends. Everything depends on what will happen to the country itself. Will the fighting parts come into terms and drop their arms? Will there be peace so these people can come back? Because in many cases, many of the refugee camps are already turning into cities. some of the refugee camps in Turkey are already making roads inside the refugee camps and trying to change their temporary homes with more long-lasting homes, you know. Well, one of the biggest refugee camps in Jordan, the Zatari refugee camp, is now Jordan's third or fourth biggest city, can be considered. It's been 2 years, 3 years since these camps existed, and it might probably take a decade. The average civil war, the other day I was reading, lasts almost 12 years. I don't know if these things will last longer. Maybe you will have other Syrian cities outside of Syria. So the situation looks green.
Just as a follow-up to that last question, how much contact are people able to have with their families now? I mean, I'm not talking only obviously about Armenian refugees, but just in general. I mean, I've talked to a couple musicians over the last couple of years as I'm working on a book about a Palestinian musician, and these were one Syrian Palestinian and another Syrian musician who, you know, managed to get out and really have had very limited contact with family. What's the situation in a humanitarian sense with people just being able to find out how their families are doing?
Well, thankfully that there's internet. Thankfully there's internet that, today that people are being able to use Skype, use Viber, use different methods to establish contacts with their relatives and friends who are now inside Syria. And it depends where inside Syria, under government control or under rebel control, because most of the places under rebel control, the access to electricity and internet is so much limited than where it is than the places that are under the government control. Even the places under the government control have long hours of electricity cuts. The internet doesn't work for long hours of the day, and it doesn't even work properly when it works. So the establishing contact is a major issue. For example, you might not be able to speak for your family member for days, but eventually there is internet and you are being able to contact them. But there's the other side of this conflict. It's not about the technical stuff. It's about the psychology. When you are outside of the country and you read the news and you have all the access to information and to see what's happening, for example, in a certain geographic place, and you call that person, that relative or friend who's living there, and you ask them, they somehow became adapted. They got adapted with the situation. Like they were adapted so much that even though you can hear the gunfires and the bombings from the other side of the phone, but the person who's on the other side of the phone keeps telling you that they are okay, they're fine, that they will not be killed. You know, people got adapted with that. It's like putting a frog in a boiling water and putting a frog in a normal water and boiling it later, you know?
Yeah, it's the normality of horror.
Yeah, at the first case it will jump right away, and in the second case it will stay in the water and burn later.
Yeah. Well, Harout Ekmanian, thank you so much for illuminating us in the situation with your eloquent words. Please join me in thanking Harout.